Today we're going to start talking about water quality. Water quality is a huge topic. It covers a lot of ground. I've taken an entire class in graduate school just on water quality, and we're going to try to cover it mostly in one lecture. It touches on a lot of stuff we've already talked about and that we will talk about in the coming weeks as well. And the way I summarize what water quality is all about is how suitable is water for its beneficial uses. So beneficial uses are defined in the Clean Water Act, and they can include things like municipal and industrial use, things like cold or warm water fish habitat, recreation like swimming or fishing, and agriculture. And there's a lot of others as well. But essentially what we're saying here is, what are people using the water for? And once we know that, we can say, well, what kind of water quality do we need in order to meet that? I wanted to remind you, going back to the first day of class when we did this exercise, and we came up with lots of questions regarding the city of Live Oak and their wastewater discharge. And I went through and highlighted just in green all those questions that I thought were specifically related to water quality. So the dominant question, I would say the plurality of the questions that you guys raised had to do with water quality. What's downstream and upstream? Is there anything living in the river? Where do people get their water? What type of vegetation is alongside the river? Does society have a say in what goes on around the area? Are there existing factories, heavy water use? What's the ecology? What type of activities? What kind of trees? Is the river already polluted? What will the waste affect? Can we discharge whatever we want? Do people swim? Do people boat? All these questions get at this topic of water quality. And so, with that in mind, let's define a couple of things. These are things, criteria, objectives, and standards are words that even water quality professionals get mixed up on a lot, and so I wanted to define what these are. So a criteria, or criterion, is any numerical value defining a threshold water quality. So an example I'll use over and over is the contaminant nitrate has a criterion of 10 milligrams per liter as N. This is a number that says 10 milligrams per liter as N is where we start seeing potential effects of that blue baby syndrome that I mentioned previously in class. Right? If people or babies consume water with too much nitrate in it, they can have acute toxicity where they have trouble circulating oxygen in their blood. And so that 10 is a criterion. Then there's objectives, which are state or federal numeric values or narrative thresholds that legally cannot be violated. So if the state of California or the federal government adopted that 10 milligram per liter as N threshold as a water quality objective, now if you exceeded that criterion, you would be in violation of the law. So criteria is just a number. The objective is we're going to take that number and we're going to make it some sort of law. And in the case of nitrate, that has happened at the federal level, and then also states have adopted as well. And then there's a water quality standard, which combines both a water quality objective and a beneficial use. So the water quality standard might then say, we have this water quality objective for nitrate that uses this 10 milligram per liter as N criterion. And we're going to say that the water quality standard is that we can't violate 10 milligram per liter as N in order to protect the municipal and industrial beneficial use. So if a water body had that beneficial use assigned to it, then you could not violate the objective. Otherwise, you'd be violating the water quality standard. Okay? So just some definitions. Getting into some of the regulations. So whether we're talking about drinking water or surface water, groundwater, wastewater, we have different types of regulations. With drinking water, it's a lot simpler. The Safe Drinking Water Act establishes MCLs, which stands for maximum contaminant levels. And these are established at the federal level, and then most states adopt these as their own state levels as well. So I'm not going to get into a lot about what we call primacy and whether the United States EPA or state EPAs kind of have the final say. But generally speaking, most states have their own regulations and laws that they use to protect the environment. But in some cases, the United States EPA can come in and say, you're not regulating strictly enough. We're going to enforce the federal standards at this level. With MCLs, usually the federal government does all the work to establish what they should be in order to protect human health, and then states will adopt those. Then in the surface water, groundwater, and wastewater world, it's a lot more complicated. Every state tends to have their own set of objectives. Sometimes those are based on federal criteria, like in the case of drinking water, but sometimes not. The National Toxics Rule is a federal set of objectives or criterion that states can adopt. In California, you have the California Toxics Rule, which governs a lot. Other states have other things as well. So those are the basic regulations. What affects water quality? So point sources, wastewater treatment plants, or industrial discharges or spills, these are things where we call them point sources because you can attribute the pollution to a single point where it entered the waterway. And through the 70s, 80s, 90s, after the Clean Water Act was passed, most of the regulation had to do with point sources. And to a large degree, a lot of those have been cleaned up, regulated. Not all of them, but there's a lot of money and effort that goes into those. In part because we can see them, we know where they are, they're easier to regulate. Versus non-point sources, which can include mostly runoff, agricultural and urban runoff. This is where the source is distributed and can enter the water body from a lot of different areas. And thus it's harder to regulate these kinds of things. A lot of what has to be done is not treatment necessarily, but prevention of pollution in the first place. And natural sources can also contribute as a non-point source. So most of the rest of this video I'm going to spend going through a bunch of water quality constituents. We tend to reduce water quality as a topic into the individual constituents that affect it. And there's a lot of interesting details around all of these, and there will be some homework that kind of will help to round out what all of these different things are and how they affect water quality, but you'll get a lot of that from the lecture, and then you can do a little bit of research on your own to figure out the rest. So first of all, temperature. Why do we care about temperature? Well, first and foremost, this affects fish habitat. The fish that tend to be most sensitive to temperature are what we call salmonids. So this includes trout and salmon. Oops. There we go. And I'm not going to get into all the specific thresholds, but 68 degrees Fahrenheit is about the point where you start seeing, if you're any warmer than that, you see potential toxicity to trout and salmon. And so if you have a cold cold freshwater habitat beneficial use designation, you tend to be concerned about that sort of threshold. And if you can protect for that, if you're colder than that, then you can also be protecting for warm water fish, which are more tolerant of warm water but can also live in cold water as well. So temperature is primarily about fish habitat, although it can have effects on other beneficial uses as well. Dissolved oxygen, we've talked a lot about dissolved oxygen already in class. We're mostly concerned again about aquatic life here. So we've talked about the 5 milligram per liter threshold is common for most aquatic life, though it'd be ideal to be higher than that. But some aquatic life can survive at lower values than that. But for the most part, 5 milligrams per liter is a good threshold for general aquatic life health. So that includes fish, macroinvertebrates, algae, well, not so much algae, but things like salamanders and frogs and so forth. pH. So pH, we know, can affect a lot of other water quality constituents. When we talked about acid-base reactions, we know it affects the carbonate system. It can affect toxicity of different species. But in general, so this can have impacts on a lot of different beneficial uses. We generally want to see pH in the 6 to 8 range as good. We can be slightly outside of that, but depending on the situation, it can be harmful if you're lower or higher than that. So that tends to be a good range. All right, what about nutrients? So nitrogen and phosphorus. These are really important ones. Ammonia, oops. Why is it doing that? There you go. Well, ammonia is the first one. So ammonia is a form of nitrogen. And we care about ammonia for a couple of reasons. The first reason is something that you would encounter if you had a fish tank at home. Tropical fish tank, you're usually worried about the ammonia levels in the tank. Waste from animals contains ammonia, including our waste, but the fish waste contains ammonia, and if it gets too high, it can actually be toxic to fish. So the level itself can be toxic. But there's a second reason we care about ammonia, and that is that it exerts a BOD. We talked about NBOD, the nitrogenous biological oxygen demand. That is ammonia. So in the process of nitrification, in which bacteria convert ammonia into nitrate, they consume oxygen in that process. So the more ammonia you have, the more BOD you exert, and that can be a problem, again, for aquatic life. So ammonia is primarily an issue for aquatic life. The next one, also nitrogen containing, is nitrate itself. And we've already talked about nitrate, that it can be a human health issue, blue baby syndrome. And that's 10 milligrams per liter as N. That's the primary issue with nitrate itself. But for both nitrate and phosphorus, as well as ammonia, we also have another issue we need to be concerned about, which we recently learned about, which is eutrophication, which is bad. And that can be bad for human health or aquatic life. Right, so if eutrophication happens, we could have dissolved oxygen crashes, which are bad for aquatic life, but we could also harm human health by having, say, toxic algae blooms that can happen. It can be bad for recreation as well, in that people don't want to swim or fish in areas that are full of algae. So as far as nutrients go, these are sort of the big ones. And then organic carbon. So carbon is also technically a nutrient. Organic carbon means carbon from living things. So not carbon that's like bound up in a mineral or a rock, but carbon from living things. And this one is primarily a concern because it is a disinfection byproduct DBP precursor. So in our Water 4.0 reading, we read about the chlorine dilemma, and that when we chlorinate water, we can form trihalomethanes, haloacetic acids, other kinds of disinfection byproducts. What we need in order for that to happen is the chlorine and some organic carbon. And it's the chlorine acting on the organic carbon that can create those trihalomethanes. Methane and contains a carbon, and that doesn't come from the chlorine, which is just chlorine or sodium hypochlorite or something like that. The carbon comes from the organic carbon. So the more organic carbon you have, the more likely you're going to have disinfection byproduct formation when you chlorinate. So too much organic carbon in the water could be a concern for drinking water. Of course, organic carbon is also necessary as part of the carbon cycle for life. So you need to have some organic carbon, and you always will if you have any kind of aquatic life in your ecosystem. So it's always going to be there. We just don't want too much of it if we're going to be using drinking water. All right, so salinity. A few different topics within salinity. The first one is chloride, which is the chloride ion, Cl-. I don't know if I can superscript here. Oof. That didn't work. All right, well, Cl-. This is primarily a taste and odor concern. If you have too much chloride in the water, people will taste or smell it. I think I might have mentioned this in class before, but I had to do some research on the MCL, the maximum contaminant level for chloride, which is 250 milligrams per liter. This is what's called a secondary MCL. Primary MCLs are things that are there to protect human health. Secondary MCLs are those that are there to protect against aesthetic concerns like taste and odor. So not a danger for actual health and well-being, but people don't like it. Or color is another aesthetic issue. So it turns out that the 250 milligram per liter threshold goes back to studies that were done, I think, in the 1950s or 60s that showed that at about that threshold, if you made coffee with the water that contained chloride at that level or higher, people could detect a change in the taste of the coffee. People can't actually taste the difference just by drinking the water until it's quite a bit higher, closer to 400 or 500 milligrams per liter. But we want to protect people's coffee. It's important. So chloride is one. But then salinity affects a lot of other things. There's these two constituents, electrical conductivity and TDS. Electrical conductivity is easily measured because all we have to do is put a probe in the water and we can measure how conductive it is. But that parameter in and of itself is not really directly relevant to fish or us or whatever. It's just how conductive the water is. But the more salts that are in the water, the more salinity, the more easily it will conduct electricity, so the higher the conductivity. But usually what's a more direct impact is what we call TDS, which stands for total dissolved, and then either salts or solids, usually solids. That would be all of the things that are dissolved in the water that if you evaporated off all the water, all of those solids would be left. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about different kinds of measures of solids. But this just is just a general measure of how much salinity is in the water. And this can affect fish. Obviously, freshwater fish can't be in too salty of water. They won't survive. Aesthetics of drinking water, if it's too high, and human health of the drinking water itself, right? You can't drink seawater and survive. So it can affect a lot of different things. Municipal and industrial, definitely. A lot of if there's a lot of salts, there will generally be a lot of scaling in industrial processes, which is really bad for those. Scale up pipes and pumps and things like that. One thing I wanted to mention in this portion too is this cation and anion balance issue. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this in class, but I know that the FE exam can sometimes ask questions about this, so I want to at least mention it. So water has to be neutral. And so to the extent it has dissolved ions in it, like these guys, which are the cations, calcium 2+, magnesium 2+, sodium, potassium, on an equivalent basis, it has to have the same amount of negative charge. So some negatively charged ions might be sulfate or fluoride or chloride or bicarbonate. And you can look down, and if you plotted then both of them on an equivalent basis, here you can see on this horizontal bar the ion concentration milligrams per liter as CaCO3. Here's all the positively charged ones converted again to milligrams per liter as CaCO3, and then the negatively charged ones as well. They should come to the same level, right? We should have the same amount of positive as negative. To the extent we don't, that just means we didn't measure something. There's something else in the water that we didn't measure, like maybe fluoride. There's a tiny bit or something right here that makes up the gap between the positive and the negative. Or just our water quality measurements aren't exact, right? There's some error in them. So that'll always be the case. Bicarbonate tends to dominate this in most waters. It doesn't show that in this, but in most natural waters, carbonate or bicarbonate is going to dominate the negative side, and then the positive side can be a bunch of different things. Calcium and magnesium tend to be substantial in a lot of waters, but not necessarily. So related to some of this is these issues of alkalinity and hardness, which also kind of generally fall within the salinity category. We've talked about alkalinity already. Alkalinity is that acid neutralizing capacity. Okay, we're back. It crashed, but hopefully it doesn't again. Okay, alkalinity. Acid. Oops, I gotta make it red for you so you know I'm typing it in. Okay. Alkalinity is that acid neutralizing capacity of the water. So it's going to be things like bicarbonate that can take an H+ and take it out of solution so that it's not free and contributing to a low pH. That's one thing that includes bicarbonate and a lot of other negatively charged species. Chloride would be in there too, hydrochloric acid, right? But hardness is somewhat related. And we haven't talked about hardness much in this class, but it's an important topic in environmental engineering. Hardness is technically the sum of the divalent cations, which is primarily calcium 2+ and magnesium 2+. And hardness is something that will that is a problem for a bunch of reasons. One is scale. So the more calcium and magnesium you have, the more likely you're going to form either hydroxides or carbonates. Calcium carbonate, calcium hydroxide, magnesium carbonate, magnesium hydroxide. All of those can scale up pipes and other fixtures and keep flow from going through them. Also can be an issue for taste and odor. Taste and odor. You may have drank water from a well or something that tasted kind of funny, and it might be because it was very hard water. Another big issue is what I call cleaning or lathering. So if you shower in really hard water, what will happen is you'll put soap on you or shampoo or whatever, and it'll wash off really fast. And it kind of feels, versus in soft water, when you lather up, you put soap on you, you get a lot of suds and bubbles, and then when you rinse, it's harder to get all of that soap off. And in fact, it might feel better to shower in hard water because you can get the soap off of you really easily, but you also don't get as clean. The soap hasn't done its action as well. And that's because the calcium and the magnesium ions are interfering with what the soap is trying to do. The soap is trying to take polar and nonpolar substances, the polar substance being the water, nonpolar substances being grease and dirt. It's trying to join those two together. And when there's calcium and magnesium ions in the way, it can interfere with that surfactant action. And so that's another issue. But then also, and so in order to avoid all of these things, we have water softeners. And water softening can be done at a centralized location, like at a drinking water treatment plant, or it can be done decentralized. People can have water softeners at their homes, in which they would add salt, usually, so sodium chloride or potassium chloride. And what happens in a water softener, again, is just a little beyond where we want to get in this topic, but there's an ion exchange resin in which the sodium and chloride, the salt that you buy and put in there, gets put onto this resin, and as water that contains calcium and magnesium passes by that resin, it will exchange the sodium, the Na+, into the water and take the calcium or magnesium out and attach it to the resin. And so again, remember, we need to keep this neutral balance. So if we want to take out some positively charged species, we have to put some positively charged species back in, unless we're also taking out negatives. We're not taking out negatives, we're just taking out calcium and magnesium, so we're going to replace those with the sodium from the salt that we put in. Once the calcium and magnesium are bound to the resin, we can then later on kind of close the valve and flush all of that off, putting the calcium and magnesium into the sewer system, and then regenerate the ion exchange resin with more sodium and chloride so we can restart the process. So this is a common practice in areas that have really hard water. There's whole services like the Culligan service that will manage your water softener for you. Generally can really help your water quality in your home, and keep your fixtures from scaling. But it also puts a lot of sodium and chloride into the wastewater, which can be problematic in some areas. But again, we won't get into that too much. One thing I want to just mention about alkalinity, this acid neutralizing capacity that I forgot to mention. So high alkalinity tends to be good. And the reason is that when you have a lot of alkalinity, you have a lot of what we call buffering capacity, where if something was added to the water that would change the pH, the alkalinity will buffer it and keep the pH from varying too much. Whereas if you have very little alkalinity and you had like a big storm, a bunch of stormwater runoff came in, bringing maybe acidic minerals with it, it could drastically change the pH in the water body, which could have an effect on fish or other kind of water quality. So generally, high alkalinity is good. Alkalinity and hardness tend to move together to some extent. The more calcium and magnesium there is in the water, the more negatives you need. That tends to result in having more bicarbonate and carbonate, which contributes to the alkalinity. So again, because of this issue, the more hardness you have, the more alkalinity you tend to have. But they don't move exactly together, because there's other species that are positively charged that don't contribute to hardness, like sodium and potassium, and some negatively charged ones that also don't have much alkalinity. Okay, So, moving on, trace metals or heavy metals. When we're talking about heavy metal, we're not talking about hard rock. We're talking about things, generally we're referring to things like zinc, cadmium, nickel, cobalt, copper, maybe cobalt, lead, tin, and silver is a good initial list. These things are things that are generally toxic to humans or wild aquatic life. A lot of them are things that organisms need to survive, so we need a certain amount of copper in our diet. Same with cobalt, same with zinc, but too much of it can be toxic. And the same goes for aquatic life. For things like little insects in the water or fish, copper, nickel, zinc, cadmium are all kind of pretty toxic, lead as well. And so these are kind of all lumped together usually, although they have individual different effects and toxicities. Other metals, arsenic. Arsenic is one that's a big, oops, man, it's kind of not the best. Human carcinogen. But it's naturally occurring in rocks and minerals. So it's rare that arsenic is discharged or put into the environment as a pollutant, as much as it's just naturally occurring in certain places in the earth. It tends to be in groundwater, and then it's a human carcinogen. About 15, 20 years ago, the EPA lowered its MCL for arsenic to 10 parts per billion, or 10 micrograms per liter, which is very low and difficult for drinking water plants to achieve where arsenic is naturally occurring. So again, it's a dissolved substance, sort of like a salt. It's really small. It's very hard to get out of water. You can get it out easier than salts, but it's expensive, and so that can be a problem. And there's famous cases of arsenic poisoning that have happened around the world. For example, in Bangladesh. I'll probably have a reading assignment about that in the next couple of weeks as well. So mercury, another one. We've talked about mercury as a bioaccumulative substance. And why we're mostly concerned about it is nervous system impacts in both humans and aquatic life, but primarily human health. And so again, it can bioaccumulate in fish tissue. We eat the fish, and then it can be toxic, especially to pregnant moms and to young kids. In both those situations, in the child's nervous system, there's a lot of mitosis going on, a lot of development happening. Cells are splitting and multiplying very quickly, and so if you have a little bit of damage to the nervous system, to the DNA, when those cells split and multiply, that problem persists into the new cells and becomes a much bigger problem than if somebody like me had some small nervous system impact from mercury. It might be pretty localized and only affect a little piece of my brain instead of my entire nervous system. And then selenium is another bioaccumulative. Selenium is what we call a mutagen and also a teratogen. Teratogens are cause reproductive toxicity, and mutagens can cause mutations. And so there's some famous cases. Kesterson Wildlife Refuge. I'll try to post a link somewhere so you can look that up. In California was a famous case in the last 30 years or so, where selenium toxicity was happening, and there was actually mutated birds and rodents and things found, like birds with 2 heads or fish with 2 heads have been in Idaho. There was a phosphate mine where that was happening that had a lot of selenium. I've worked a lot with a certain discharger in California that has a major selenium problem, and done a lot of bioaccumulation modeling on that. And again, the concern is that as selenium moves up the food chain into fish and then birds, that it can cause major problems. Okay, iron and manganese. These guys, again, have secondary MCLs. So these are problems for aesthetics. They affect things like taste and odor. So you may have drank water before that tastes metallic. It's probably iron. But also a big one is staining of fixtures. So iron's going to stain fixtures like a brownish red. Manganese stains fixtures like a blackish color. Sometimes you've seen maybe in toilets where water's been sitting for a long time, like a black ring in that area. That's probably actually manganese scale that's happening. So staining of fixtures or laundry. If you do laundry with water that has a lot of iron, your clothes are going to come out potentially having brown or red on them. So these are generally naturally occurring. Again, in crustal elements, iron and manganese are pretty abundant. So that covers kind of the gamut of trace metals or heavy metals. And now we're going to move to organic chemicals. Organic chemicals, there's thousands, tens of thousands that are in use. So we can't cover all of them, but I'm going to cover some of the major categories of things we care about and know about. And the first is pesticides. So there's a lot of different classes of these. OC pesticides stands for organochlorine pesticides. These were some of the first ones that were developed in the mid-1900s. So famous ones like DDT. There's other ones too, dieldrin. These can cause reproductive effects in humans and aquatic and terrestrial life. So I mentioned the eggshell thinning effects of DDT, but can also affect aquatic life, can also affect human health. And so when we discovered all of those impacts of organochlorine pesticides, there was a new class that was developed called organophosphate pesticides. There's a few of these, but the dominant 2 are called chlorpyrifos and diazinon. And these were popular in the, I would say, maybe the 1970s, but definitely the 1980s and 90s. These were the dominant pesticides used. So way back when, if you wanted to buy some pesticide at Home Depot, you bought it and looked at the active ingredient, it would have been an organochlorine pesticide, like DDT. Then when those started getting phased out, if you would have bought one 30 years ago, it would have had an organophosphate pesticide in it, like chlorpyrifos or diazinon, like in your bottle of Raid that you would spray the bees with or whatever. But then we determined that these can have effects on human health, and especially the main ones are kids and behavioral issues. So these could lead to things like ADD and ADHD when they were being used, especially around schools. That was a concern. And so these have started to be phased out as well. They are still used in agricultural settings far away from kids, although workers who have to apply them are still exposed to them as well. So they've been mostly phased out, and the new class is pyrethroids. Pyrethroids are a synthetic version of something called pyrethrin. Pyrethrin comes from chrysanthemums, the flower. And so pyrethrins have been used for centuries, if not millennia, as a means of keeping away things like mosquitoes. And pyrethrin that comes from the flowers breaks down pretty easily, so it doesn't last very long. So the synthetic pyrethrin is called a pyrethroid, and it's made so that it's more stable and can be used in fabrics, it can be used in sprays. Like now if you go to Home Depot and buy your Raid, it's going to have a pyrethroid in it, not an OP or an OC pesticide. There's about 7 to 10 common pyrethroids, things like bifenthrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, permethrin. These are the more common ones. But of course, we keep doing this thinking we're going to get away from the negative effects, but in fact, when you develop a chemical that is designed to be toxic to something, you shouldn't be that surprised when it turns out that it's toxic to things, including things you didn't want it to be toxic to. So the main issue for pyrethroids is what we call non-target effects. We have a target organism that we want to kill with pyrethroids, like ants or roaches or whatever. But it turns out that there's other bugs around that we don't want to kill, and other things around we don't want to kill. So bees is one example, but another one is that we've seen is aquatic amphipods, invertebrates. So aquatic insects, aquatic arthropods, that are extremely sensitive, and I'm talking like pyrethroids at the single-digit part per trillion levels, so even like less than 1 nanogram per liter, which is just a tiny amount. We can still see toxicity in some organisms, which is incredible. So a lot of work is being done on those. Maybe someday, well, I'm sure someday these will be phased out and some other pesticide will come on the market, and it will have its own problems that we'll eventually discover. The idea is that hopefully we're getting to better and better pesticides over time, or that we get to a point where we can address our pest problems without chemicals. But either way. And then herbicides, there's lots of herbicides, probably 50 plus that are in use, and I'm not going to go into a lot of those, but they can have a lot of the same kinds of problems as pesticides, or as insecticides, I should say. All right, PCBs, we mentioned before, these are polychlorinated biphenyls. These were the ones that were used in transformer oil, and concern mostly is cancer, although there's lots of other effects that could be from PCBs. And a big problem is that these persist in the environment for a long time. So 50, 100 years. They absorb very strongly to sediment and then just are stable. PAHs stands for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There are, I think, well, PCBs, there's actually over 200, I think 212 what we call congeners, different PCBs. PAHs, there's somewhere probably more than 100, maybe more than 200. Polycyclic means multiple cyclic structures. So like you've seen hexane is that like, not hexane. Hexane just means 6 carbons in a hydrocarbon chain. I'm talking about benzene, like a benzene ring. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons have multiple benzene rings, and potentially other things attached to them. So pyrene and naphthalene and benzoapyrene, these are all different kinds of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They tend to be formed from incomplete combustion of mostly, well, incomplete combustion. So They can be formed like if you're grilling meat and you burn some or whatnot, you can form PAHs in the meat and then eat them. If you're burning wood in your fireplace, that can also form PAHs. Forest fires can be a big source. And so these go up into the atmosphere often and then can be either dry deposited or wet deposited in rain on surfaces and wash into water bodies. And again, cancer is a big concern of these, other health effects as well. And then there's petroleum-based ones. So I'll just use as an example, BTEX stands for benzene, toluene, ethylene, and xylene. These are the main compounds that are problematic in fuels like gasoline. Cancer, big problem of those. There's lots of other chemicals that can be in petroleum-based or other petroleum-based organic chemicals as well, but those are some of them. VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Anytime you have like glues or paints, solvents, anything like that where you can like open the container and then smell it, those are volatile organic compounds. Again, lots of different kinds of health effects, cancer, other things. Depends on the compound, what it could be. And then endocrine disruptors and CECs. You've read about some of these in Water 4.0 and maybe, and we've talked about them at the beginning of the semester as well. These can be things like pharmaceuticals and personal care products, PPCPs. So the example in Water 4.0 that he gave was birth control pill, 17-alpha ethinyl estradiol, or actual naturally occurring hormones, just like 17-beta estradiol or testosterone, that can pass through wastewater treatment plants and be discharged and actually affect aquatic life in some pretty serious ways. Okay, so suspended solids, let's see, TSS stands for total suspended solids. So earlier we talked about total dissolved solids. Here's total suspended solids. These are going to be things like particles and soil and stuff that's suspended in the water. And this is, man, why does it keep doing that? This can be a problem for a number of reasons, but a major one is actually navigation. So wastewater treatment plants, when they're originally coming online, discharging a lot of solids, over a long enough period of time, those solids will settle out into the river or lake or whatever and kind of start silting things up and make it difficult for boats to get through. And so TSS is primarily a concern for navigation, although other things as well. And again, we'll come back to that in a separate video. I'll talk a little bit more about measuring TDS and TSS and all the different kinds of solids. Final class of constituents is pathogens. We tend to break this down into bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. There are other pathogens as well, like amoeba and helminths or worms, slime molds, things like that. But really, when we talk about pathogens, we're talking about anything disease-causing. So from a bacteria standpoint, some of the common ones might be meningitis. These are common waterborne bacterial diseases. Legionella, which causes Legionnaire's disease. E. coli. Again, all of these can cause disease. All of them are waterborne. Viruses, we're talking about things like typhoid, enterovirus, polio, Norwalk, the coronavirus that we're struggling globally with right now is it can be waterborne in the sense that it can survive in water for a period of time, but it's not particularly stable in water like some of these are, and so it's not drinking water is not the primary concern for coronavirus. It's possible that it could be conveyed in there, but it doesn't survive very long in water, so it's not a major concern. But some of these, like typhoid or polio, can survive in water for a long period of time, such that it could be in a water that you take out, treat in a drinking water plant, not fully kill the virus, and then it could be in the drinking water itself. Finally, protozoa. So these are not technically bacteria or viruses, but can cause disease. The two primary ones that we're concerned with are Giardia and Cryptosporidium. Giardia you may have heard of before if you're into backpacking or hiking or camping and whatnot, sometimes called beaver fever. This is why you don't want to, not beaver fever, beaver fever. This is why you don't want to drink raw water out in the environment because Giardia can be in it and can cause diarrhea and can be bad enough, the diarrheal disease that comes from it, that it can kill you. Usually doesn't, though. And then Cryptosporidium, you can see the crypto in there, which means death. This is a protozoa that can kill you. This one is not as common as Giardia, but there have been some very famous cases of Cryptosporidium in drinking water supplies. The city of Milwaukee, maybe 20 years ago, had a crypto outbreak. It killed, I'm not sure how many people, but in the tens of people, 10 to 20 in the Milwaukee area. So can be big concerns. And one of the big concerns with both of these is that these protozoa can form cysts around them that make them very resistant to disinfection. So when we chlorinate water or when we hit it with UV disinfection, if that cyst is around it, it can protect the protozoa from that. They also can live a lot longer in the environment than some of the bacteria and viruses. So several weeks they can be, or even potentially months, they can just be being conveyed in a river. So especially if they form that cyst around them, they can survive for a long period. So our disinfection guidelines, which we'll talk about later in the semester, tend to be around what do you need to do to kill these things, and if you can kill these things, then you're probably killing all of these things as well, because these are the most resistant to disinfection. Okay, so that wraps up all of water quality. There will be one other video on solids, TDS, TSS, and so forth. I might add a couple of links to other reading, and then there'll also be a quiz. Make sure to do that as well.